This is the part people skip past. But if childhood can quietly wire a person for obsession, how do you tell the difference between damage and genius? It gets even stranger when the same pattern keeps showing up in the lives of the people who change everything. Let's get into it. He followed Jobs, Doudna, and Musk like it was normal life. That is not a resume, that is a category of civilization. And the wild part is he keeps landing on the same pattern. Brilliant people often come with chaos baked in. Apparently, peace and world-changing invention are not best friends. That line about demons driving them is so powerful. But it also sounds dangerous if people romanticize it too hard. Because then everyone wants trauma like it's a productivity hack. Which is insane, by the way. He is saying hardship can shape drive, not that misery is a feature. And with Musk, he really thinks the childhood was brutal. Scrawny, beaten up, no friends, and then home was worse. That is the kind of background that can wire somebody strangely. Especially when the father is emotionally abusive and unpredictable. Did you notice how he kept saying it took a year to get that out? That felt important because the father story was not quick gossip. It was the thing underneath the thing. And the whole Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde description is not subtle. But it is probably the nicest possible way to say the guy was a lot. What I found interesting is that he doesn't reduce Musk to just trauma. He keeps saying hard wiring matters too, especially the autism spectrum piece. That focus is almost absurd when it locks in. Like teaching himself to code in a couple of days at 12. Most people learn one language and act heroic about it. He is out here building video games as a child. But the key is that he only cares about what interests him. Which is also how half of the smartest people on Earth function. Jobs had that same selective obsession, just in a different lane. Jobs cared about the feeling and beauty of the product. Musk cared about the thing that makes the thing. That is such a machine-brain distinction. One is design perfection, the other is manufacturing obsession. And that explains why he was on assembly lines instead of just in meetings. Honestly, a lot of CEOs say they are hands-on and then vanish. Musk is apparently physically incapable of staying abstract for long. He wants the rocket, the cell, the engine, the process. And that first principles thing really is his superpower. He breaks the problem back down to materials and physics, instead of accepting the usual corporate nonsense, which he clearly has almost no patience for. He seems allergic to the words, "that's just how it works." That is probably why he fights regulators so hard. He hears rules and thinks weakness in the system. Most people hear rules and think, thank God, paperwork. He hears them and wants to cut the cable himself. That server farm story is unbelievable. He decides one data center should go, and then he just forces it. The engineers say no, and he fires them. Because obviously the most calm response to a technical problem is wire cutters. Christmas Eve energy, but make it industrial. But that is why teams either break or level up around him. Did you catch that? He literally says the pressure makes people do more. That is inspiring and toxic at the same time. Yeah, it can create excellence, but it can also create a mess. And maybe that is the Musk equation in one sentence. What I keep circling back to is the childhood piece. The idea that early pain can become a template for adulthood. He even says Musk associates pain with love. That is a horrifying sentence if you sit with it. And also weirdly explanatory. Like why he keeps returning to drama instead of calm. He is not just chasing success. He is chasing a familiar emotional weather. Which makes me wonder how much of adult ambition is actually memory. That is the least flattering self-help theory imaginable. But it might be true. And then there is the parenting question, which gets uncomfortable fast. Do you protect kids from risk or do you let them bruise a little? Modern parents want a helmet for the universe. We are all out here hovering like surveillance drones. His point is that Musk was basically not hovered over. He had freedom, he got hurt, and he kept moving. Even the little kid around the rocket fire pit gets treated like that. Which is either genius parenting or a future documentary. Maybe both, honestly. What is fascinating is that Mae Musk seems to endorse the risk-taking. She calls it one generation of risk-takers training the next. That line is almost poetic. It is also terrifying if you are the child. Because resilience is not just confidence, it is exposure. But he also pushes back on the idea that this is universal. Some people have awful childhoods and become lost, not legendary. So the hardship is not the magic ingredient by itself. It is the combination of hardship plus unusual wiring plus opportunity, which is a very annoying recipe because you cannot order it online. If only trauma came with a settings menu. He also makes the point that Musk was not some perfect student prodigy. He was good, but not all 800s, not flawless. The obsession showed up only where the interest was real, which is relatable, sadly. School often gets ignored by the exact people who later get worshipped. He even says Steve Jobs was similar in spirit, just more design-focused. Jobs wanted beauty, feel, and insane detail. Musk wants physics, scale, and execution. It is like two different flavors of obsession, and both of them are driven by a refusal to accept the ordinary. That ad he mentions, the Crazy Ones one, is basically a manifesto. Also, one of the most self-serious ads ever written. But it worked because it gave people permission to be weird. And weird in this context is not an insult. It is almost a prerequisite. Still, I keep thinking about the cost. If you are that driven, what do you lose along the way? Peace, probably. Maybe also softness. And possibly your ability to enjoy a normal lunch. Absolutely not on the menu for these people. The most interesting thing, though, is that Isaacson does not flatten any of it. He sees the brilliance and the damage in the same frame. That is the honest way to look at powerful people. Not as saints, not as monsters. Just extremely complicated humans with very expensive toys. That is such a brutal summary. Anyway, next episode is where it gets even messier. We get into what this kind of intensity does to companies, teams, and families. That access is wild because he was not doing souvenir interviews. He was basically living in the room with the chaos. Morning, noon, night, rocket fumes, wire cutters, all of it. That is how you actually learn what makes someone tick. Not by asking them the polished podcast version. Exactly, not the TED Talk cut. Jobs was the design obsessive. Musk was the execution obsessive. That difference matters more than people admit. One is staring at a beautiful plug. The other is yelling at a factory. That is unfair but also painfully accurate. Jobs wanted the object to feel inevitable. Musk wants the machine that makes the object to survive reality. And that is why he ends up on the assembly line, not in the mood board room. Mood board room is funny, though. He would probably hate that room on principle. What Isaacson keeps circling is the childhood piece. He is basically saying the fingerprints never leave. Which is the annoying truth, because everybody wants a cleaner origin story. But the misfit pattern is too consistent to ignore. Da Vinci, Einstein, Jobs, Musk, all these people felt out of place first. Apparently the universe loves awkward children. That should be on a mug somewhere. The difference is how the awkwardness gets metabolized. Some people collapse, some people build empires, and some people become unbearable at dinner parties. That too, very much that too. Musk's version sounds especially brutal. No friends, getting beaten up, then coming home to psychological abuse? That is not a childhood, that is a pressure cooker. And then people act surprised when the adult is volatile. Isaacson is not excusing it, but he is explaining the wiring. That matters because explanation is not endorsement. The internet does not love that distinction, though. No, the internet wants villains or superheroes. But this is more like someone built from damage and brilliance together. That line about darkness and light coming from the same roots is strong. It is almost depressing how true it feels. Because if you remove the dark side, maybe you lose the drive too. Which is a terrible bargain if you are trying to be a normal human. Normal human is already hard enough. Then there is the father piece, which is where it gets uglier. 2 hours standing there while your father tells you that you are a loser? That is the kind of thing that lives in a person for decades. And then the father is still somehow intellectually part of the story. That is what makes it so messy. He is not just escaping the father, he is also inheriting parts of him. That Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde comparison is doing a lot of work. Basically, the man can engineer and emotionally combust at the same time. That is the most concise diagnosis possible. What I found interesting is Isaacson's point about the energy going into the wrong place sometimes. Like the same force that builds rockets also blows up teams. That is the price of that level of intensity. He is basically spending 80% of his mental life on engineering reality. 80% is insane, by the way. Most people spend 80% trying to avoid effort. And he is out there calculating rocket material costs like a man possessed. That first principles thing is the real unlock. He does not start with tradition, he starts with physics. Tradition is basically a suggestion with better branding. That is exactly how he would treat it too. And that is why regulators make him crazy. He hears caution and translates it as bottleneck. He does not hear, please be careful, he hears, please stop. Sometimes that instinct is genius, and sometimes it is a disaster. Exactly, because the same trait that helps him see around corners also makes him bulldoze people. That is why the Twitter story feels so on brand. Christmas Eve with wire cutters is a sentence nobody else gets to say. He really just cut the cable? That is one way to do leadership. Aggressively, yes. But the weird part is it can also force teams past their limits. People do things they did not think they could do because the bar gets hit with a hammer. That is not healthy, but it is effective in some ugly way. The childhood parallel is where it really lands for me. He was left alone, not hovered over, and risk became normal. The motorcycle at 11 or 12 is almost cartoonish. South African childhoods sound like a different species sometimes. But you can see how that turns into the kid in the fire pit. He literally associates pain with love, which is devastating. That line stayed with me too. And then the mother says maybe it is one generation of risk-takers training the next. That sounds wise until you imagine an actual child near a fire. Right, because philosophy ends when someone reaches for hot metal. Still, the bigger question is whether we overprotect kids now. Isaacson seems to think we probably do. And every parent hears that and immediately feels attacked, including the ones pretending they are very chill. I like that he does not make it a simple trauma equals success story. He keeps saying it is not 1-to-1, but it is not 0 either. That is probably the most honest answer in the whole conversation. Annoyingly unsatisfying, which usually means true. Exactly, truth is rude like that. And then Jobs sits there as the counterpoint with a different kind of obsession. Less about manufacturing, more about the aesthetic and the emotional aura of the thing. Which is funny because people flatten Jobs into a design guy and forget the force behind it. He was also brutally intense, just in a cleaner package. Cleaner package is doing heavy lifting there. But that makes the comparison richer, not simpler. Jobs thinks different, Musk thinks first principles, and both are allergic to permission. Permission is for normal people and committee chairs. And people with sleep schedules. What Isaacson is really asking is whether greatness needs damage. And I do not love that question, but I do think it is a real one. Because the answer might be, not always, but often enough to be uncomfortable. That is the sentence that ruins your dinner. Completely, yeah. Still, you can see why people are fascinated by these figures. They are proof that intellect alone is not the whole story. The emotional chaos is part of the machine, and that is what makes genius feel expensive. Not just financially, but humanly. That is the real bill. Which is why I think the biographer role matters so much here. He is not worshiping them, he is documenting the cost. Someone has to be the adult in the room. Barely, but yes. And that is what makes the conversation land instead of just becoming fan fiction. We are not just asking how they won, we are asking what it did to them. Exactly, and that is the only interesting question left. All right, let's leave it there before we start parenting the entire internet. Because that would go terribly. Next episode, the mess gets into the companies and the families. That is where the damage and the genius start colliding in public. And honestly, that is where this gets even better. Walter makes genius sound less like magic and more like damage with a target. That is what hits me because it is not just brilliance, it is pressure. And pressure is weirdly the engine here, not the side effect. Which is a terrifying sentence to say out loud, by the way. He keeps saying these people are driven by demons, and he is not being poetic. He is basically saying the furnace is part of the machine. Which is a horrible way to build a child, but a great way to build a company. That is exactly the problem, yes. Jobs wanted the product to feel inevitable, and Musk wants the factory to obey. Those are almost two different religions. One worships taste, the other worships throughput. And Walter is saying both are world-changing, just in different ways. But I do wonder if we romanticize the mess because the outcome looks so shiny. Like if Elon does not become Elon, this is just a very sad childhood. You know what I mean? The story only feels noble after the win. But Walter keeps forcing the question back to cost. Cost is the whole thing, honestly. Because people love the rocket launch and skip the psychological wreckage. And with Musk, the wreckage is not even hidden very well. It is basically on the dashboard. The part about his father is the ugliest piece, because it explains the volatility. That is not just a bad dad story, that is a wiring story. And Walter saying he needed a year to get that out of him tells you everything. He was basically interviewing the silence for months. Imagine spending that long trying to get one man to say one thing about his dad. That is a biography and a hostage negotiation. Exactly, and then the silence finally cracks. What I love is that Walter does not flatten it into therapy speak. He keeps it human, but he also keeps it structural. Like, yes, trauma matters, but so does obsession and talent and timing. And the internet wants one clean cause, which is why it gets everything wrong. The first principles stuff is where it gets really fun, though. Because he is not saying Musk is smart in a vague way. He is saying Musk strips problems down to physics and cost. Basically, all the fluff gets fired immediately. People love that until they are the fluff. The Russia rocket story is such a clean example of that mindset. He gets rejected, then just rebuilds the problem from raw materials. That is insane confidence, honestly. Or insane stubbornness, depending on whether you work for him. Same trait, different payroll. That line should be on a mug. What is fascinating is Walter almost admires the engineering but distrusts the human cost. He is basically saying Tesla and SpaceX fit Musk better than Twitter ever could. Because machines cannot feel emotionally bullied in the same way. They can fail, though, and he still bullies them. That Christmas Eve server farm story is pure Musk mythology. He literally shows up with wire cutters like a villain in his own biopic. It is so extreme that it circles back to funny. But the scary part is it works because everyone else is playing safe. That is what Walter keeps circling, the gap between comfort and capability. He keeps asking whether hardship is necessary, and he never fully pretends it is. Which is good, because the second you say it is necessary, people start worshipping pain. And that gets dangerous fast. Still, he does seem to be saying it is at least a factor. Not a moral good, not a prerequisite, just a multiplier sometimes. That distinction matters a lot. Because it leaves room for great people with good childhoods too. And it does not turn suffering into a sacred resume line. Which the internet desperately needs, by the way. Otherwise, everyone starts auditioning for tragedy. I also like how Walter uses himself as a counterexample without making it performative. He says basically, I had a warm childhood, so I am more observer than fire runner. That is actually such a useful frame. Because not everyone is built to sprint into chaos and call it purpose. Some of us like a chair that does not explode. I respect that deeply. The parenting part is where this really starts to sting, though. Because he is not saying neglect children and hope for greatness. He is asking whether too much hovering kills resilience. And that question is annoying because it is probably true in some cases. The little X story is wild because it looks irresponsible at first glance. But then you hear Musk say he played with matches behind a tree. Of course, that is his parenting philosophy. May Musk calling it one generation of risk-takers training the next is such a loaded line. It sounds wise and reckless at the same time, which is basically the family brand, apparently. But it does connect to the broader point, which is that extreme capability often comes with extreme tolerance for risk. The question is whether you can teach that without teaching damage. Walter is not optimistic about easy answers there, and I think that is honest. Honest is almost the rarest thing in these conversations. Because everyone wants a clean lesson, and this is messier than that. He even brings in Franklin to show that curiosity is trainable, but genius is not on command. That is a really nice correction to the usual hustle nonsense. You cannot just buy a trauma subscription and unlock rocket mode. Please do not give anyone ideas. The best part of the whole conversation is that Walter keeps refusing to make genius wholesome. He lets it stay expensive, weird, and a little bit dangerous, which is probably the only honest way to talk about it. And that is why this episode works, because it does not flatter anybody. It just keeps asking the uncomfortable question right in the middle of the room. What did it cost, and was the cost inevitable? That is the whole thing. And somehow he makes that feel like a thriller. We should probably stop before we start building a philosophy degree out of one biography. Too late, we are already halfway there. Next time, the companies get involved and the damage becomes public. That is when the family story stops being private and starts hitting payroll, which is when everybody suddenly becomes an expert. Episode 2 is where it gets louder, uglier, and way more fun.